In the beginning, our marriage was steady, maybe a bit predictable, but that was what made it feel secure. Emma and I had crossed paths through mutual friends, both of us wanting a straightforward life. Meals together, lazy weekends, and a future that seemed stable, built on love. Sure, there were challenges, but none of it felt like more than we could handle. The kids gave our lives structure, and I always believed the years we shared would hold us together no matter what. But over time, cracks started showing. We got too comfortable, too set in our ways. Our conversations shifted from talking about dreams to just coordinating schedules, and even being together felt like going through the motions. I ignored all the little signs, Emma's distant stares, the sharp tone in her voice, thinking it was normal after 2 decades together. I assumed our connection was strong enough to weather whatever came our way. But I was wrong. Very wrong. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and said hi to Emma, and she didn't even bother to acknowledge me. By then, I'd gotten used to her cold silence, so I didn't think much of it. Later, after washing up, she came into the bedroom and asked how my day went. I was excited to tell her about my promotion, but her deadpan response made my stomach churn. Something wasn't right. I asked about her day, and that's when she hit me with, "Luke, I want a divorce." It was like the air got sucked out of the room. I couldn't make sense of it. Completely blindsided, I asked her why, and after a moment's hesitation, she blurted out, "I've met someone else. We're going to be together." The words felt like a punch to the gut. I've dealt with surprises in my sales job for years, but this was a whole different level. "You met someone? What? Are you just looking for a fling?" I snapped, not even sure what I was saying. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around it, but her words weren't computing. "It's not like that," she said, barely able to look me in the eye. "It just happened." I was frozen, her words echoing in my head while I stayed silent, like I was waiting for the ground to disappear beneath me. "Stop looking at me like that," she snapped again. I must have looked completely lost, like I had no idea what hit me. "Luke, I love him. I'm sorry. I didn't want it to be this way," she said, her tone hollow and flat, before walking out of the room. I was left standing there, a whirlwind of emotions swirling around me. But the one question that stuck was why. None of it made sense. No reason, no logic to explain why she was ripping our marriage apart. I should have been furious, but instead I was just stuck trying to piece together how we got here. I went downstairs, determined to talk to her, but she wasn't in the kitchen. The house looked exactly the same, nothing out of place. Emma always took pride in being a perfect wife and mother. God forbid she ever work outside the home. I checked the garage, went out to the backyard. Nothing. Maybe she's out walking, clearing her head, I thought. But as I waited, the anger started to bubble up inside me. She'd probably let some smooth-talking idiot sell her some fantasy. I grabbed a beer and sat down in the den, waiting for her to come back. When I woke up, it was already dark, and the house was still eerily quiet. I called out her name, but there was no answer. The silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Then it hit me. She wasn't coming back. I scrambled for my phone, dialed her number, and heard it ring upstairs. I followed the sound to our bedroom where her phone, credit cards, checkbook, and a sealed envelope all lay on the nightstand. It was like she had just erased herself from our life, leaving everything behind like none of it mattered anymore. Standing there, it hit me how meaningless all of it seemed now. I couldn't stand being in that room, so I left completely drained and overwhelmed. That night, I couldn't sleep, but the next morning, I dragged myself to work, still in a daze. I managed to get through the day without anyone noticing, but her words kept playing on a loop in my head. The rest of the week was a blur, nothing but raw emotion. When the weekend came, I couldn't bear the thought of sitting alone with my thoughts, so I got in the car and just started driving. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. As I drove, I kept asking myself if I even wanted to stay married to her. Did I want to hold on to someone who didn't want me anymore? I didn't know. I missed the Emma I married 22 years ago. Not this cold, unrecognizable version of her who had cheated and decided to toss everything away. It felt like a lifetime had passed since she dropped that bombshell, even though it had only been a few days. The harsh reality was she didn't want me anymore, and no matter how much I hoped otherwise, I knew she'd made up her mind. At some point, I found myself on the back road that led to a secluded lake Emma and I had discovered years ago while looking for retirement property. We never ended up buying land there, but we loved the place. The lake's peacefulness, with the sunset reflecting off the water, used to bring me a sense of calm. But now I hated it. I didn't want peace. I wanted to scream. Still, I got out of the car and sat by the lake, lost in thought. As the sun set, the memories of all the happiness we used to share came flooding back, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I got up and walked back to the car, and that's when everything hit me at once. I couldn't hold back the emotions anymore. They finally broke through. I collapsed to my knees, fists slamming into the ground, cursing everything. My life, fate, and especially Emma. I screamed her name until my throat burned, pouring all the anger and betrayal out into the night. But once the fury ran its course, I was left with nothing but raw pain. Betrayed. Abandoned. The rejection cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. Alone in the darkness, with no one but my grief, I sobbed harder than I ever had in my life, even harder than when I lost my sister. Back then, Emma had been by my side, holding me together. Now, she was the reason I was falling apart. There was no one left to comfort me as I mourned the death of our marriage. As I sat there, tears staining my face, I thought about our life together. I realized just how much I loved her, not just for the big, obvious moments, but for all the little things too. I made sure she knew I cared in my own way. I never took her for granted, always appreciating her, even if I didn't say it every day. Sure, we had our fights, but they never felt like they were bigger than the love we had, or at least the love I thought we had. Now, it was all ruined, destroyed by her infidelity. And while I could have blamed my long hours at work, I knew deep down that I'd missed the warning signs. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. As the first light of dawn crept in, my emotions finally settled into a dull ache. I knew the days and weeks ahead were going to be hell, but I was ready to start picking up the pieces. My hands were swollen and bruised from pounding the ground, but I didn't care. It was time to get my life in order. Even though it was the weekend and I couldn't contact a lawyer yet, I decided to check our finances, expecting Emma had already drained our accounts. But to my shock, she hadn't touched the money. That wasn't what I expected from a cheating spouse, and for a moment, it gave me hope. Maybe this was just a mistake, a lapse in judgment, and she'd come back. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But then I remembered the cold, detached look in her eyes when she left. That hope I was clinging to evaporated. She wasn't coming back. I couldn't figure out why she hadn't taken the money, though. Maybe she trusted me not to screw her over, or maybe she was just waiting for the legal process to unfold. Either way, I knew divorce was inevitable, and no matter how much it hurt, I had to accept it. That's when I remembered the manila envelope she had left behind. As much as I dreaded going back into the bedroom, I knew I had to see what was inside. With a heavy heart, I grabbed the envelope, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I carried it back to the kitchen and sat down, staring at it like it was some kind of bomb. I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. Instead, I picked up her phone, searching for clues, anything to make sense of this mess. But there was nothing. Just my number from when I'd called her earlier. She'd erased everything else, wiped it clean like I didn't exist. I didn't know if I should laugh or cry. When she got that phone, she insisted on having a separate account, and the bills went straight to her. Now, there wasn't a trace of any of it. Her clothes were still hanging in the closets. Our kids' photo albums sat on the shelves, untouched. I couldn't understand it. Why leave behind things she'd need to move on with her life? I set those questions aside and finally worked up the nerve to open the envelope. My full name was written across it in her handwriting, the same handwriting I'd seen 1,000 times before, but now it felt foreign. I ripped it open with shaking hands, already knowing it was the final nail in the coffin of our life together. Inside were the divorce papers, life insurance policies, our marriage certificate, the kids' birth certificates, and the deed to the house. But there was something else, a smaller envelope with my name on it, written in Emma's familiar script. I held it for a moment, my heart sinking. I knew whatever was inside would be painful, but I needed to know. It took me a couple of tries to tear it open. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper, front and back, filled with her handwriting. I took a long drink from my beer before reading it. Dear Luke, I'm not sure when you'll find this letter, but by now, you know that I've left you for someone else. This wasn't something I planned, and I'm so sorry for the hurt I've caused you. You trusted me completely, never doubting me, and that makes this even harder. I've been struggling with the guilt. You've been an incredible husband and father, and I know this will devastate you. I don't want to go into details because I don't want to hurt you more than I already have. I met someone by chance, and over time, our connection grew into something more. This isn't your fault. You've been everything I could have asked for, but I couldn't ignore my feelings any longer. Neither could they. They're also married, and they've left their spouse and kids to be with me. If it helps at all, we haven't been intimate. We've both agreed not to cross that line until we're officially divorced. We didn't want to add more hurt to an already painful situation. I've left everything behind because I'm starting over, and dragging this out in court wouldn't make things better. I'm not asking for anything from you. You've worked hard for everything, and I won't take that away from you. By now, I hope I've already spoken to the kids. They had no idea about any of this, so please don't blame them. I'm not asking for your forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it, but I hope in time the kids can forgive me. I want to stay in their lives, but that's up to them. Leaving you wasn't easy, Luke. I'm walking away from 22 years of marriage from a man who's been nothing but good to me, and I feel the weight of my betrayal every day. There were so many times I thought about telling you the truth, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. There were times I almost told you, hoping you'd do something to stop me, but it's too late now. These feelings have taken over, and I can't undo them. I wish you a long and happy life, however you find it. Please don't try to come after me. We'll be overseas until both divorces are final. I've left you a card with the name of an attorney, Ethan Sinclair. He has full power of attorney to handle everything. All you need to do is sign the papers. Please don't fight this. It'll only drag out the pain for both of us. I'll return once the divorce is done, but we won't see each other again. I've kept his identity quiet to avoid causing more problems. If we ever meet again, I hope we can be friends, but that's your choice. Luke, I still love you and always will. Emma. Reading those last words, my eyes filled with tears, and I couldn't hold them back. I promised myself I wouldn't cry anymore, but her words ripped open the wound I thought had started to heal. The pain and anger surged up again, but this time, I was too drained to feel anything but this deep, suffocating emptiness. I stuffed everything back in the envelope and left it on the table, feeling utterly lost, with no idea what to do next. I knew I needed legal advice, and I felt a strange relief knowing someone else would help carry this load. Emma had avoided giving too many details, but I've always been good at reading between the lines. I knew I'd end up rereading that letter over and over, searching for what she hadn't said. That entire weekend dragged on, every minute weighed down by the reality of it all. She claimed she hadn't slept with him, and though I didn't believe it, I still found some twisted comfort in getting rid of things around the house. I moved our bedroom furniture to the garage, boxing up her clothes, even though the smell of her still clung to every piece. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it was better to face the pain head-on than let it slowly eat away at me. The rest of the month followed the same empty routine, except my attorney seemed oddly pleased with how things were turning out. No demands from Emma, no messy financial fights. He said it was the cleanest divorce he'd seen in a long time. I was glad someone found joy in this mess. As time went on, I couldn't help but wonder more about the man she left with. He had to be wealthy. She didn't take anything with her, which meant she probably figured he'd buy her whatever she needed. And he was definitely connected, keeping them hidden overseas like that. She'd left her driver's license behind, almost like she was planning to vanish completely. Emma covered her tracks too well for this to be something she'd done alone. I was sure she had help, but even my neighbors didn't notice anything unusual. They only saw her leave every day around 11:30 a.m., nothing strange to report. I pieced together that her lover had also walked away from a wife and kids. That fact, combined with his money, gave me a place to start looking. The rich are always easier to trace. Over the next few weeks, I talked with my attorney several times. He kept pushing me to sign the divorce papers, saying Emma might come back and cause more trouble if I didn't. I shared that fear, but I wasn't ready to sign yet. In our no-fault divorce state, everything earned during the marriage was considered communal property. Since Emma had stayed home, I could end up losing half of everything and paying hefty alimony. I wasn't about to just hand it all over without understanding more about what had really happened. Using some contacts from work, I started narrowing down who this man could be. I knew he was rich, probably in his late 30s or 40s, and his wife would likely be in her 30s or 40s too. It wasn't much to go on, but I zeroed in on a few likely suspects. It felt like a long shot, but it made sense. The tricky part would be figuring out which one of their wives had a missing husband. That's when I realized what I had to do. I needed to contact this guy's wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife, and let her know. It sounds simple, but it wasn't. After more digging, I found that most of the men on my list were constantly traveling for work, often overseas for long stretches. The question now was, which one hadn't come back? Which husband had quietly left his family behind for Emma? If her lover had briefly returned home before vanishing again, it would make him even harder to trace. But deep down, I couldn't believe two grown adults, supposedly madly in love and now free from their spouses, could keep things platonic during all this time away. Sooner or later, a look, a touch, something would happen, and they'd have plenty of time for it to happen. It took me several more days to narrow down my list to 3 men. Meanwhile, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I repainted and recarpeted the master bedroom, bought new furniture, trying to make the room feel like mine again. I hadn't moved my things back in yet, still waiting to find a few final pieces that would make it my own. It was strange how much had changed. When I thought my marriage was solid, the bedroom was just a place to sleep, or occasionally, to make love. But now, it felt like a completely different space, like I was reclaiming something I didn't even realize I'd lost. After Emma left, the bedroom felt like a place haunted by gloom. I knew it was just in my head, but it weighed on me, leading to my decision for a complete makeover. I had spoken with my kids a few times since their mom left, and it was clear that Emma had told them even less than she wrote in her letter to me. They had so many questions, some of which were embarrassing and ones I couldn't even begin to answer. I think they assumed I knew more than I was letting on, and though they didn't say anything directly, I could sense that they might have been blaming me for their mom leaving. There was this unspoken accusation every time we talked, hanging in the air. I was relieved both my daughters lived out of state. One had just gotten married, and although I wasn't fond of her husband, he treated her well enough. The other was in college and set to graduate next year. If they'd been closer, I knew they would have been all over me about the divorce, asking too many questions, and honestly, I couldn't handle that. I was barely managing as it was. We're starting to feel a bit more normal. I was finding some emotional stability, at least enough to function. My boss, Oliver Preston, noticed my earlier mood swings and erratic behavior. He expressed concern, but I knew his real worry wasn't my well-being. It was whether I could still bring in clients and close deals. I assured him I could, and that was the end of it. Still, I caught some of my coworkers giving me curious looks. We weren't exactly close, but I had gone out for drinks with a few of them before. I kept my personal life private, so I knew there were rumors circulating about Emma leaving. Whatever they were, they never made their way back to me. A few colleagues asked how I was holding up since Emma left, but I never gave much away. It wasn't something I wanted to discuss. Oddly enough, I started noticing some of the women in the office paying more attention to me. Or maybe it was just in my head. I wasn't exactly looking for anything, but a few weeks after Emma left, I realized I was starting to notice women more. The problem was, I'd never been good at picking up signals. If a woman smiled at me or gave me a certain look, I usually panicked and bailed, not sure if she was being friendly or flirting. During my marriage, I never had to think about other women. Emma was all I knew, and that was enough for me. After she left, I started exercising more. I had always been a little concerned about my weight, but it wasn't something I stressed over. I used to squeeze in 20 minutes of exercise in the mornings just to keep the scale in check. But now, I threw myself into a full workout routine, running, lifting, the works. It gave me a way to burn off all the anger I had inside. I also decided to get better at cooking. The internet is full of healthy recipes, and it wasn't long before I was whipping up decent meals and eating better than I ever had during my marriage. My weekday evenings became pretty predictable, cooking, cleaning, fixing things around the house, working on my project to uncover who Emma had run off with, then winding down with a bath and bed. I guess I needed the routine to keep myself from falling apart. The weekends were tougher at first. With so much free time, it was hard not to get lost in my thoughts. But I remembered something my mom used to say, idle hands are the devil's workshop. So, I tackled home repairs, starting with the master bedroom. I wasn't much of a handyman back when Emma was around. I always had her call someone. But now I figured I could learn. My first attempts were a disaster, but over time, I got the hang of it. It turned out to be good therapy, better than any bottle of whiskey could offer. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. Instead of drinking myself to sleep, I focused on my project, figuring out the identity of Emma's lover. Strangely, it helped ease my pain just a bit. By the fourth month, I had settled into my routine, and that's when something surprising hit me. I hated my job. Sales isn't just about pushing products. It takes serious drive to keep going year after year. And now, the motivation that kept me going was gone. I had enough saved to retire, though I'd have to live more modestly. Like most people, I had dreams and ambitions that life had pushed aside. I thought about writing a book or inventing something groundbreaking, but I quickly realized those ideas were more fantasy than reality. Instead, I started thinking about opening a small business, selling something useful, though I wasn't sure what just yet. Meanwhile, my attorney kept pushing me to sign the divorce papers. He was looking out for me, I know, but I ignored him. I was too focused on finding out who Emma had left me for. My daughters, on the other hand, were less understanding. They didn't want their parents to get divorced, but they were coming to terms with the fact that it was inevitable. They gave me a hard time, not because of anything I did, but because they were hurting too. Throughout all of this, I hadn't heard a single word from Emma. Not a call, not a letter, nothing. The kids hadn't heard from her either. I assumed her attorney, Ethan Sinclair, was keeping her updated on everything, but whenever my lawyer tried to track her down, Belgium stayed tight-lipped. That only made me more determined to uncover the truth. My attorney had one last option in his pocket: filing an alienation of affection claim. It was a risky move, dependent on a judge's discretion, but it might give us leverage. He was ready to fight, though I could tell he was frustrated. If I signed the papers, I'd keep everything, and he'd get his easy victory. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. By the time I hit the 6-month mark, I was done pretending. I absolutely hated my job, and the thought of doing it for another year, or even another month, was unbearable. But I kept at it because it paid the bills, and more importantly, I might need the money for whatever legal mess was ahead. With that in mind, I dabbled in day trading, only using money I could afford to lose. It was a rough start. I lost more than I gained. But after a few weeks of trial and error, I started seeing small profits. I wasn't striking gold, but it was enough to keep me engaged. I'd never been one to take big risks, but once Emma left, a lot of my reasons for playing it safe went out the door with her. During those months, I also started taking karate classes at the suggestion of a friend. It became a lifeline, bringing structure and discipline to a life that had felt completely out of control. I wasn't aiming to become a black belt. It was more about finding balance and learning how to defend myself. Before I knew it, I was training 6 days a week. I hit the gym in the mornings and karate at night, getting into the best shape I'd ever been. When I couldn't sleep, I'd get up and practice my moves for 15 or 20 minutes, and it always helped calm my racing thoughts. Something else came back into my life: shooting. I'd learned to shoot during my time as a paratrooper, but after marrying Emma and having kids, I got rid of my guns. Still, I missed target practice, so I'd occasionally rent a firearm at the range. Now, with no one around to tell me otherwise, I bought my own gun and got a concealed carry permit. But this wasn't some midlife crisis hobby. I took that step after something strange started happening. About 2 weeks after Emma left, I began noticing things around the house that felt off. My keys weren't hanging in the usual order. A book on my nightstand had been moved. My daughter's handmade bookmark wasn't sticking out like it always did. At first, I brushed it off, but as the little details added up, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my house, searching for something. It spooked me enough to change the locks, install an alarm system, and put up security cameras. I even went back to the range and signed up for NRA home protection courses. Maybe I was just being paranoid, or maybe living alone after all those years with Emma had thrown me off balance. I didn't know what to think, and I wasn't sure if I was imagining things because of my lingering attachment to her. But I did start to wonder if I still loved her at all. Love doesn't survive without care, and ours had been neglected for too long. I knew I'd have to face that truth if I ever saw her again. Then there was the divorce. Part of me wondered why I didn't just sign the papers and be done with it. The terms were in my favor, and I had everything to gain by moving on. But something in me resisted. Maybe it was my pride, refusing to let go of the life I'd built. I didn't have a good answer, so I tried not to dwell on it. I wasn't completely alone, though. Word had spread around the office about my separation, and suddenly, a few women started showing more interest. As I got into better shape, that interest seemed to grow. I went on a couple of dates, but nothing ever panned out. My mind was still too wrapped up in finding out what had happened with Emma, and the women I went out with could see that. After a date or two, they'd realize I wasn't emotionally available and back off. I wasn't ready for anything serious. Not until I got the closure I needed. My search for Emma had stalled. I had narrowed down her lover to 3 possible men, but none of them seemed to fully match. So, I shifted gears. Instead of focusing on him, I started to wonder where Emma could have met him. I mapped out every possible place within a 30-minute drive from our house. Malls, coffee shops, parks, anywhere public where she could have crossed paths with this guy. The sheer number of locations was overwhelming, and I almost gave up before I even started. But then I thought, what else am I going to do? I wasn't an investigator, but it seemed logical to ask around. I printed out the latest photo I had of Emma, along with images of the 3 suspects, and started visiting places during my lunch breaks. I'd spend an hour or 2 each day asking questions and showing photos, following a route I planned out to save time. I managed to visit 3 locations a day, but I avoided weekends. Those days were still too raw, filled with memories of when Emma and I spent time together. By the 3rd week of this routine, I finally got a break. I'd gotten better at approaching people without seeming desperate or creepy. On a Friday afternoon, I stopped by a cafe and bar, where a female server took a long look at Emma's photo. She hesitated, but after a bit of gentle persuasion and a little cash, she started talking. She didn't recognize the men in my photos, but she did remember seeing Emma with someone else. Gray beard, glasses, neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair. I didn't recognize the description, but she confirmed they'd been there together several times. I left the cafe feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Finally, I had a real lead. That day, my mood was so good even my coworkers noticed. I closed a tough deal at work and earned a bonus, plus a rare compliment from my boss. Despite everything, I was starting to feel optimistic again. Using the server's description, I had a composite sketch made of the man. The sketch showed someone who looked like he belonged in academia. Neat, well-groomed, maybe a professor. But when I searched online, I couldn't find anyone who matched. Still, it was the first real clue I'd gotten, and it gave me the motivation to keep going. A few weeks later, I was close to giving up. The search had gone cold, and I was running out of ideas. I even brought the composite sketch to work, planning to keep searching during lunch breaks. One day, a coworker, Julian Rivera, walked by my desk and noticed the sketch. To my surprise, he recognized the man. He told me the guy was a regular donor to one of the charities our company supported. Julian couldn't remember his name right away, but a few hours later, he came back with it. Samuel Brooks. Hearing that name felt like hitting the jackpot. Sometimes, it's the smallest things that can crack open a big mystery, and getting this name felt like a real breakthrough. I thought about doing more digging at work, but something about Julian's reaction made me think it was better to handle it at home. Oddly enough, my house had started to feel like home again, despite the memories of Emma that still lingered in every corner. That night, I dove into researching Samuel Brooks. Turns out he wasn't just some rich guy. He was a billionaire. A dot-com success story from the 90s who had his hand in everything from airlines to weapons research. He had a younger wife, Grace Thompson, and 2 kids, but there was no mention of any long trips abroad. In fact, he seemed like a homebody. His wife kept an extremely low profile, which can't be easy when you're married to someone with that kind of money. I started to piece together what Emma had meant when she warned me in her letter, but I was still left asking myself, why my wife? Why would a guy like Samuel, who could have any woman, be interested in Emma? It didn't make sense. Grace was gorgeous, the kind of woman who could easily grace a magazine cover. While Emma was attractive, she wasn't in that league. My initial excitement about finding Samuel's name quickly faded, replaced with confusion and a deep sense of loss. A billionaire? I had been thinking Emma's lover might be a millionaire, but this was a whole different level. These were people surrounded by tight security and constant protection. Reaching out to Samuel's wife now seemed impossible. I had no idea what Emma had dragged us into. That night, I went to bed feeling more dejected than ever. The rest of the week felt much the same, uneasy and unsure. It was as if some part of me was resisting the truth, afraid of what I might find. But the internet is full of information, useful or not, and I kept digging. I found out more about Samuel and Grace. Samuel might have been incredibly wealthy, but he had the look of a quiet professor. Meanwhile, Grace's beauty only made the whole situation harder to understand. I kept asking myself, why Emma? But I was no closer to finding an answer. For the next few weeks, I researched Samuel Brooks's business ventures. While a third of his companies were publicly traded, the rest were private and nearly impossible to investigate. My day trading, which I had started to take more seriously, had been a mixed bag. I'd set aside $10,000 initially, but after blowing through most of it, I invested another $20,000. That turned into small profits, but I didn't really hit my stride until I'd sunk almost $40,000 into it. After that, I began seeing more significant gains. By the 6th month after Emma left, I finally made a decision. I quit my job. My boss and coworkers tried to talk me out of it, but I'd had enough. I told them I didn't want to work anymore, not in sales. Between Emma leaving and my day trading taking off, I didn't need the paycheck. I had nearly $2 million in assets, 40% from day trading, the rest from savings and equity in my mortgage-free home. I had $400,000 in cash and a 401k I could tap into if necessary. Financially, I was set for a while. Emotionally, I was far from stable. Realizing Emma had run off with a billionaire, not just some rich guy, made me reconsider my approach. Getting close to Samuel was nearly impossible, but I shifted my focus to his wife, Grace. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to learn about her. She lived an extremely private life, and there were even rumors of estrangement between her and Samuel. It wasn't surprising, considering his lifestyle. I did discover that Grace and the kids lived in a sprawling estate in Bronxville, New York, but Samuel rarely spent time there. At this point, I had no ties holding me down. I quit my job, and my daughters, Sophie and Mia, were both doing their own thing. Sophie was married and living out of state, while Mia was finishing up college and preparing for her master's degree. They had been a huge support for me through everything, but they were also dealing with their own pain. Emma's sudden departure hit Mia the hardest, especially since they'd always been close. At first, Mia blamed me for her mom leaving, but as the weeks dragged on without a word from Emma, that anger shifted. I didn't stop Mia when she angrily said her mother was dead to her. It was like some small, twisted part of me felt vindicated. At least Emma had lost one of her daughters, even if she didn't care about me anymore. Sophie, too, eventually began venting about her mother. By the time I realized it had gone too far, it was too late. I understood their anger, though. They felt just as betrayed as I did. I know this story seems disjointed, and I apologize, but my thoughts were all over the place. Divorce, in many ways, feels like a death, and I was going through the stages of grief. Denial hit first. I didn't believe Emma was truly gone. Then came the anger and bargaining. I found myself praying at night, promising to go back to church if she'd just come home. Depression set in by the 3rd week and lingered. Acceptance, though, that was still beyond my reach. I figured that wouldn't come until I saw Emma again, face to face. At the start of the 7th month, things started to shift again. My attorney called, asking what I wanted to do about the divorce. I knew I needed to make a decision, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. Months had passed, and I hadn't heard a word from my lawyer. I figured the divorce had already gone through, since I never signed anything. So when I found out it hadn't been finalized, I was floored. Something wasn't right. The very next day, both Mia and Sophie called, and for the first time since she'd left, they had spoken to their mother. Mia was in pieces. It took me a solid 10 minutes just to calm her down. As soon as she realized it was her mom on the other end of the line, she let her fury explode. She told Emma she was dead to her, that she wasn't welcome at her graduation or wedding, and that she'd never meet her future grandchildren. The conversation ended with Emma apparently sobbing uncontrollably before the call cut out. Sophie's call with Emma started out a little more civil. Sophie, always more measured than Mia, tried to get some answers. Where had her mother been? What had she been doing? But, as expected, Emma wouldn't give any details. Sophie, having already heard about Samuel Brooks from me, tried a different tactic. She mentioned his name. Emma gasped, stumbling through a denial, but Sophie wasn't having it. She snapped, telling her mom how much she had hurt me, how she had abandoned us all for some billionaire. Emma started crying again, repeating that she loved them and that she was sorry, but it didn't make a difference. Then, at 3 a.m. the following morning, my phone rang, jolting me awake. My first thought was that something terrible had happened to one of my daughters. After fumbling with the phone, I finally answered, groggy and on edge. Hello. Luke. I'm so sorry. My two girls hate me. It took me a moment to register the voice, but I knew it was Emma. I asked, "Who is this?" And just like that, the line went dead. I tried calling the number back, but no one picked up. Later, when I tried again, the number was disconnected. I was able to trace the call. It had come from Bronxville, New York. That's when it hit me. Emma was back in the country, likely living with Samuel. But something didn't make sense. That estate in Bronxville was supposed to be for his wife and kids. Was Samuel sneaking around, or had they taken over while his family was away? I remembered I'd tried to contact Samuel's wife, Grace, a few weeks earlier. I got nowhere. She didn't take calls from strangers, and that was that. I knew I was dealing with the ultra-wealthy, people who lived in a bubble of privacy and security. This wasn't the kind of world I could just waltz into. The next day, I focused on my day trading, hoping for a distraction. I made $27,000 in a few trades, and for a moment, it felt like I was back in control of something in my life. That night, around 11 p.m., I decided to do some late grocery shopping. As I was heading back to my car, I felt someone grab me from behind. "You need to stop asking about Mr. Brooks," a voice whispered. And that was it. All the anger, the frustration, the months of feeling powerless, it came rushing out of me. I twisted free, kicked the guy hard in the knee, and wrenched his arm behind his back. "Who the hell are you?" I growled, holding him in a way that I could easily break his arm if I wanted to. This wasn't some random street thug. He was in good shape, probably in his 30s, and had a professional air about him. "You're making a big mistake," he hissed, trying to keep his cool despite the pain. Then I felt something cold press against the back of my head. "A gun." "Let him go," another voice commanded. I knew I was in a tight spot, but I stayed calm. "We're at a standoff," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You can shoot me, but I'll still break his arm. You'll have gunfire in a public lot, and that'll attract a lot of attention. Besides, I've got a hidden microphone on me, recording everything. You kill me, and it'll all lead straight back to Samuel Brooks." There was a pause. Then, the guy with the gun asked, "What do you want?" "Take 2 steps back. Keep your gun on me," I said, my mind racing. "I'll let your friend go, but you walk away first. You've delivered your warning. Message received. Once I feel safe, I'll release him, and we can all go on our way." After a moment, the guy agreed. "We were only here to warn you," he muttered. "We weren't supposed to hurt you." I slowly helped the first guy back to his feet. He looked furious but was clearly outmatched. "I can still break your arm," I told him, low and steady. "Let's not go there." I instructed the second man to walk away. He did, though he kept looking back to make sure I wasn't about to try anything. When he was far enough away, I released the first guy and pushed him toward his friend. But as he turned to leave, he spat one final warning: "Stay away from Mr. Brooks." That's when I pulled out my 9mm and aimed it right at his head. "Tell your boss I don't give a damn about him," I said coldly. "If he wants to keep his secrets, he'd better leave me alone." The guy paled, clearly not expecting me to be armed. He and his partner backed off and left without another word. I thought about following them, but I knew it wouldn't lead anywhere. Their car wouldn't be tied to Samuel, and this confrontation wouldn't help me get closer to the truth. I gathered my groceries and drove home, trying to calm myself down. When I got back, I poured a stiff drink and sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of everything. The pieces were coming together, but they still didn't add up. Samuel Brooks was definitely the man Emma had run off with. But why? His wife Grace was stunning and seemed like a kind person. Why would a billionaire like Samuel choose my wife over her? None of it made sense. Then it clicked. It wasn't about love or attraction. This had to be about something else, something deeper. The reaction to Sophie mentioning Samuel's name, the attempt to contact Grace, that's what had triggered the warning. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if Emma had gone into witness protection. Maybe that's why she left so suddenly, why she cut off contact. But that didn't explain why she hadn't taken the girls and those guys tonight. They weren't federal agents. They were too sloppy, and even with all my self-defense training, I shouldn't have been able to take one of them down like that. No, these men worked for Samuel. I was sure of it. But that left 2 big questions. Why did Samuel want me away from Emma? And why did Emma leave without so much as a word? Thinking back to who she was before we got together, I couldn't help but wonder if there were things about her I'd never really known. Emma was 26 when we got married. Before we met, She had worked as a bookkeeper and lived with her parents until they tragically died in a house fire just before we started dating. She lost most of her personal belongings in that fire, which I never thought much about until recently. Now, it hit me how little I really knew about her life before me. She had an entire past I'd never questioned, and now, that missing history gnawed at me. One thing that always fell off was her phone. She insisted on having her own cell plan, separate from mine and the girls. Even though it would have been cheaper on a family plan, she didn't care. She had the bill sent directly to her, and I never saw any of it. I let it slide back then, but now that she was gone, I couldn't shake how much it bothered me. It felt like there was something I had missed all along. Right around the time I found out the divorce wasn't finalized and learned about Samuel Brooks, I came up with a plan. I needed access to Emma's phone records. So, I set up a meeting with her lawyer, pretending I wanted to discuss the final settlement. I played the concerned husband, claiming I needed to review all the paperwork before making any decisions. The lawyer laid everything out on the table, and while he was distracted, I discreetly snapped photos of the general power of attorney Emma had signed over to him. Back at home, I altered the document to make it look like I had the power of attorney. It wasn't perfect, and I knew it wouldn't hold up to any serious scrutiny, but I hoped it would be enough. The next day, I went to the cell phone provider's store and presented the fake document. They asked for Emma's password, and I got lucky. I remembered seeing her type it once. She had used a combination of our daughter's birth dates. I entered it, and to my relief, it worked. They handed over the last year's worth of her phone records. Back home, I combed through the statements, looking for anything unusual. Most of the calls were routine. Nothing jumped out at first. But then I noticed a pattern. Once a month, she had been calling a number in Bellevue, always on the same day, always at the same time. The call started about 8 months before she left. And then, as her departure approached, the calls increased. The day before she walked out on me, there were 5 calls to that same number. At first, I assumed she had been calling her lover this whole time. The thought of her secretly maintaining this relationship while living under my roof made my blood boil. But something about the timing didn't make sense. If this affair had been a recent development, why had she been making these monthly calls for so long? And why always on the same day, at the same time? The sudden uptick in calls just before she left raised even more questions. I tried calling the Bellevue number, but it had been disconnected. Another dead end. Frustration built inside me. Every time I thought I was getting closer to answers, the trail would go cold. There were moments when I considered signing the divorce papers just to be done with it all. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't rest until I had some clarity, some understanding of why this had all happened. After that unsettling encounter with the men in the parking lot, I realized there was one lead I hadn't fully chased down yet. Samuel Brooks's estate in Bronxville, New York. With no real plan and only vague ideas, I packed up my car and made the 13-hour drive. I didn't like going in blind, but I had to do something. The whole way there, I debated whether to bring my gun. I knew New York had strict laws, but the irony of strict weapon laws in a state with such high crime rates wasn't lost on me. When I finally arrived in Bronxville, I checked into a small motel. I wanted to pay in cash, but the staff insisted on a credit card. We compromised. I let them run my card, but they promised not to charge it unless absolutely necessary. I made up a story about hiding from my wife until our divorce was finalized, and the motel clerk seemed sympathetic enough to leave it at that. The next day, I drove over to scout out Samuel's estate. It was massive, surrounded by a high wall that screamed, "Keep out." The front gate had guards, but they were discreetly hidden from plain view. With my telephoto lens, I snapped photos of every guard I could spot. Then, one of them caught my eye. He was the same man I had taken down in the parking lot back home. That was all the confirmation I needed. I was in the right place. Now I just had to figure out how to get closer. Later that day, 2 moving trucks arrived, and my heart raced. I worried they might be preparing to leave. The guard spoke to the drivers, and after a while, the trucks left. But something told me they'd be back. I was desperate to get inside that estate, to see for myself what was going on. But I'm no professional spy. Every idea I came up with felt foolish, like I was playing out some bad movie plot in my head. The estate was enormous, covering an entire block, so I made a few slow passes around it, staying off the main road to avoid the front gate. On my third pass, something caught my eye, a large tree with branches that stretched over the wall near the northwest corner of the property. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I went to a nearby hardware store and picked up a collapsible ladder and some rope. Then I parked my car a block away, just in case I needed to make a quick getaway. I returned to the tree, hid the ladder and rope in the bushes, and waited until I was sure no one was around. Once the coast was clear, I set up the ladder and climbed up into the tree, looping the rope around my neck. I kicked the ladder over to avoid suspicion. If I needed to escape, I'd use the rope. 7 months ago, there's no way I would have had the strength to pull myself up into that tree. But now, after months of working out, it was almost easy. I climbed higher, trying to get a clear view of the backyard. It was sprawling, beautifully landscaped with an expensive grill, outdoor furniture, a TV, and a large oval-shaped pool with a waterfall and slide. What really caught my eye, though, was Grace Thompson. She was lounging by the pool with a book, completely relaxed. Seeing her in person, I understood why she had such a quiet reputation. She was stunning, even more beautiful than I expected. Then, the sliding glass door opened, and a man stepped out. He stayed in the shadows for a few minutes, making it impossible to see his face. I held my breath, waiting. Finally, he moved toward Grace and leaned down to kiss her. My stomach dropped. It was Samuel Brooks. This wasn't what I expected. The man who had stolen my wife was still living with his own. It was all a mess. Everything I thought I understood had just come crashing down around me. Suddenly, chaos erupted inside the house. 2 men with weapons, silencers attached, stormed in, barking orders and forcing Samuel and Grace back inside. My heart raced. I had no clue what was happening, but it was bad. I grabbed my phone and called 911, breathlessly telling the operator there had been a shooting. I wasn't sure if there had been one, but I knew it would get the police there faster. I'd already tied off the rope, so I threw it down and slid out of the tree in seconds. My mind raced as I sprinted toward the house, every step bracing for the gunshot that would cut me down. But none came. The sliding glass door was still open when I got there. I slipped inside, moving as quietly as I could, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crept toward the voices, adrenaline fueling every move. Peeking around the corner into a massive living room, I froze. There were 7 people. 4 were strangers, but the other 3? My heart sank like a stone when I saw Emma. She was sitting on the couch next to Grace and Samuel. My wife. My betrayer. Please, Leo, Samuel pleaded with a man standing in front of them, his voice tight with fear. Let the women go. I'm the one who took the money. I can get it back, and more. The man, Leo, gave a twisted smile. Short and heavy-set. He had the kind of face that enjoyed other people's pain. It's not about the money anymore, he said, his voice cold. It's about honor. You stole from us. And that woman, he pointed his weapon at Emma, got my brother Alex locked up for 20 years. My breath caught. I felt the blood drain from my face as Leo leveled the gun at Emma. I wanted to rush in to stop him, but something held me back. Leo sneered, clearly not caring. She knows too much. I'm not leaving any loose ends. Before I could process that, Samuel interrupted, desperation in his voice. You're going to kill us anyway, right? Can I at least ask a few questions before it's over? Leo, apparently enjoying the power he had over them, smirked. Why not? I've got a few minutes. One of my men is checking something for me anyway. What is it? Samuel asked. Leo chuckled, clearly enjoying this. I was surprised when you and your bookkeeper showed up here last night, he said, eyeing Emma. We've been watching this place for weeks, figuring your wife would lead us to you. But then you came back. Must have been something in this house you wanted, something your wife couldn't get for you. Just then, another man walked into the room, grinning. You were right, Leo, he said. I found the safe, hidden in the floor. Leo's smile widened. He turned to Samuel. Your mistake was loving your wife too much. You should have trusted her with the combination. But no matter. We plan to follow her anyway. She would have led us to you. Samuel sighed, defeated, and looked at Grace with sorrow in his eyes. But why go after Emma? He asked, his voice softer. She was just a bookkeeper. Leo laughed. Your personal bookkeeper, he corrected, his eyes gleaming. You treated her more like a daughter than an employee. I figured she knew where your money was, how to access it. And she did. She knew every property you owned, every place we could search for you. How did you find out Grace informed on your brother? Samuel asked, glancing at his wife. Leo's smile faltered, but he regained his composure. Grace was clever. Even your husband didn't know she was the informant at first, he said, addressing Grace. It took years of digging and a lot of money to trace it back to you. But we did it. I have to hand it to you. What do you call yourself now? Samuel Brooks? That was smart. You and your wife vanished, got plastic surgery, and came back as billionaires. But most of that wealth is smoke and mirrors, isn't it? It was all a front. Leo paced slowly, his gun still trained on Samuel. I know you didn't steal $1 billion. So how much did you take? 40? 50 million? 78 million, Samuel replied, his voice hollow. 78, Leo echoed, nodding with a trace of admiration. You were always the smart one, Jacob. My brother trusted you. You took our dirty money, cleaned it up, and turned it into legitimate businesses. But you got greedy. You skimmed more than you should have, and you hid it where we couldn't find it. Samuel shifted uncomfortably, guilt etched on his face. Alex figured you out, Leo continued, his voice growing colder. He was ready to take you out when your wife here. He shot a look at Grace, ratted him out to the feds. That threw everything off. But eventually, we found your bookkeeper. I planned to grab her and torture her family, one by one, until she gave you up. But then she vanished. That's when I knew there was a mole in my organization. I clenched my fists. They had been after Emma. My wife had been in hiding, running for her life, and I never knew. It didn't take long to figure out the mole was Kelly, Leo said, his voice lowering. She tried to run, but we got her. She jumped from a second-story window. Died on impact. Kelly's dead, Samuel asked, clearly shaken. Yeah, Leo said casually, as if her life hadn't meant a thing. She thought she could escape, but she didn't make it. After she was gone, I tapped into her family's phones, figuring they'd lead me to you. That's how we finally tracked down your real identity and found this place. If you knew where we were, why didn't you strike last night? Samuel asked, a mixture of fear and confusion in his voice. Leo shook his head, annoyed with himself. I outsmarted myself, he said. I figured you'd need new IDs, so I blocked the delivery. My plan was to replace the moving van drivers with my guys, but when the IDs didn't come, you sent the trucks away. That's when I decided to move in. He shrugged. And now here we are. Leo's eyes darkened as he stepped closer to Samuel. Enough talking. I need the combination to the safe. You can give it to me now, or I can start eliminating people. I'll start with your bookkeeper, then your wife, then you, or I'll just cut the safe open if I have to. My mind raced. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I had one option. Only one. Leo, I used to think your brother was the lowest scum I'd ever met, Samuel spat through clenched teeth. But you've managed to sink even lower. Leo's lips curled into a twisted smile. I'll take that as a compliment, he said, laughing. And don't worry, I'll make sure Alex knows you're thinking of him. Now, enough with the pleasantries. Let's wrap this up. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The months of anger, fear, and confusion I'd been drowning in faded into the background. All that mattered now was what I had to do. I wasn't sure I'd make it out alive, but I wasn't going to stand by and watch this unfold. I quickly ran through everything I'd been taught about firearms. Eliminate the biggest threat first. I flicked off the safety on my Ruger and raised it, my hand steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. I only had seconds to make each shot count. I took a slow breath and squeezed the trigger. Leo jerked forward and crumpled to the ground, my bullet hitting him square in the back. I didn't wait for anyone to react. My next shot went to the man aiming at Emma. He dropped without a sound. Chaos erupted as the other men scrambled, but I kept firing. A third man fell just before I felt a bullet rip into my left side, but I didn't stop. I aimed at the fourth, then the fifth. Both went down, but not before another shot slammed into my shoulder. The pain was unbearable, but I forced myself to keep going, blood running down my face. I wasn't sure if it was from the wound in my shoulder or from a graze on my head. My vision blurred, but through the haze, I saw her, Emma. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with shock and fear. I tried to say something, but no words came out. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to the floor just as the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The last thing I saw was Emma rushing toward me before everything faded to black. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was the sterile smell of a hospital. My whole body felt like it was weighed down by a heavy blanket of pain. I tried to move but felt the cold metal of handcuffs around my wrist. I groaned, pressing the button for the nurse. To my surprise, it wasn't a nurse who walked in. It was Emma, with a police officer close behind her. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Luke," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Are you okay?" I blinked at her, trying to focus through the fog of pain. I'm just hurt." I managed, my throat dry. "Can someone give me something for this pain?" A nurse appeared moments later, injecting something into my fore. Slowly, the pain began to dull, though it still throbbed in my shoulder and side. Emma sat beside me, her hand trembling as she took mine in hers. The officer stayed at the foot of the bed, watching us in silence. "I'm so sorry, Luke," Emma began, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry for all of it, for putting you through this nightmare. I didn't know what else to do. I knew what Alex and Leo were capable of, and I was terrified they'd come after you and the girls. I thought the only way to protect you was to make you think I'd found someone else, to push you away." She broke down into sobs, her body shaking as she held my hand tightly. I was too weak to say much, but I squeezed her hand back, hoping it would give her some comfort. "You did it to protect us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, you should have told me. I spent months thinking you'd left because you didn't love me anymore. It tore me apart. I couldn't understand why you would abandon us." "It wasn't abandonment," she cried, her tears falling freely. "Samuel convinced me that the only way to keep you and the girls safe was to make you believe I didn't care anymore. I almost broke when I saw how much pain I was causing you, but I couldn't risk it. I was trying to protect you all." I let out a shaky breath, the weight of her words settling over me. It made sense now, but it didn't make the pain go away. "I tried so hard to figure it out," I said. "I searched for you. I needed to know why you left. And I think I led Leo and his men right to you. I'm sorry." "No, Luke," Emma said, her voice fierce through her sobs. "This wasn't your fault. It's mine. I made the mistake of calling you and the girls because I missed you so much. I wasn't supposed to. Samuel warned me that they'd be watching for any slip-up. But when I found out how much Mia and Sophie hated me, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to die, but I couldn't tell you where I was or what was happening. Samuel was trying to get us new identities and a safe place to hide, but it wasn't happening fast enough. The medication was starting to take hold, and everything around me felt distant. My eyelids grew heavy, and the conversation started to blur. Before long, I drifted into a drug-induced sleep. The next time I opened my eyes, sunlight streamed through the window, and the steady beeping of machines filled the room. I glanced down at my arm, which was heavily bandaged, and winced at the dull ache in my side. The pain wasn't as intense as before, but it still throbbed with every movement. Emma was asleep in the chair next to my bed, her hand still holding mine, her head resting on the side of the bed. For a moment, I just watched her, the way her chest rose and fell softly, the lines of worry etched into her face even as she slept. I tried to shift in bed to get more comfortable, but the handcuffs made it impossible. The noise must have woken Emma because she jerked awake, alarm flashing in her eyes. "Luke, what are you doing?" she asked, hurrying to adjust my position. "Just trying to get comfortable," I said with a small, weak smile. She carefully moved me into a more comfortable position, then leaned down and kissed me softly. I never thought I'd feel her lips on mine again. My heart clenched at the warmth of her touch. "I love you, Luke," she whispered against my lips, tears brimming in her eyes. "Can you ever forgive me?" I looked in her eyes, feeling the weight of everything we had been through. "Emma, I still love you," I said, my voice soft but steady. I thought about signing the divorce papers so many times, but I couldn't do it. Not after 22 years of marriage. I couldn't let go without knowing why. I couldn't believe you'd stop loving me. I needed to understand. "Oh God, what did I ever do to deserve you?" She sobbed, collapsing onto my chest, crying harder than I'd ever seen. When she finally calmed down, I told her to take the key to my motel room and get some rest. She looked exhausted, and I knew she needed sleep. It took some convincing, but she finally agreed. The policeman standing at the door wasn't thrilled about letting her go, but after a call to his superiors, he relented. As I lay in bed, I learned from the officer that the district attorney was considering pressing charges against me for carrying an illegal firearm. It seemed like this nightmare wasn't over yet. It seemed ridiculous. After I just helped take down a major criminal organization, the DA was concerned about a concealed carry permit. But I was in no position to argue. Once Emma left the hospital room, I asked the nurse for my cell phone, only to find out the police had confiscated it. Eventually, they let me use the hospital phone, and I called both Sophie and Mia. I told them everything, though I left out the part about me being in the hospital until the end. They were upset, as expected, and immediately insisted on flying in to see me. Both of them were devastated when they learned what their mother had been through and regretted the way they'd treated her. I tried to calm them down, telling them not to be too hard on themselves. I knew they'd reacted the same way I had, wounded and confused. About 10 hours later, Sophie arrived at the hospital, exhausted after catching a flight to LaGuardia and renting a car. Emma had stepped out for coffee, so it was just the two of us when she walked in. Sophie looked pale, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of me hooked up to machines, bandaged from the gunshots. "Oh, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you going to be okay?" "The doctors say I'll be fine," I assured her as she leaned in to hug me, her touch gentle, as if I might break. "They're discharging me tomorrow." By the time they cleared me for release, the DA had decided not to press charges as long as we agreed to be available for testimony if needed. A small victory in this mess. Minutes later, Emma returned. I hadn't told her the girls were coming. I wasn't sure how she'd react after everything they'd said to her. For a second, they just stared at each other, the weight of the past months hanging between them. Then, without a word, Sophie rushed into her mother's arms, and they both broke down, crying and apologizing. For hours later, Mia arrived, and the same scene played out again. Tears, apologies, and hugs. It was overwhelming to see the pain finally dissolve into something like forgiveness. Before long, all three women were clustered around my bed, fussing over me like I was fragile. Eventually, the nurse insisted I try to get up and walk. Emma and the girls hovered, refusing to leave my side, helping me shuffle around the room. Tears stung my eyes. After everything we'd been through, my family was together again, stronger than I'd ever thought possible. In the weeks following the shootout, I learned that Leo and two of his men had died at the scene. The other two had survived surgery and were now facing charges that would likely keep them in prison for life. Leo's brother, Alex, was also indicted for his crimes. All of Samuel's guards had been killed. Fortunately, the FBI kept my name and Emma's out of the media, just as I'd insisted. I also obtained a court order to seal the records, making sure our names would stay out of public reach. Samuel and Grace cooperated with the feds, turning over valuable information that helped dismantle parts of the criminal network still hidden. In exchange, they were sentenced to community service and forced to surrender much of their wealth, most of it locked in bitcoins inside the safe. Somehow, they'd managed to keep enough bargaining chips to avoid jail time. After their service was completed, they left the U.S. quietly, likely with some hidden fortune intact. A year later, we received a postcard from Spain that simply said, "We're sorry for everything. Thank you." Having Emma back home felt surreal at first. I still had lingering resentment for her leaving, even though I understood why she had done it. She, too, struggled with her own demons, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming from nightmares. Counseling helped us work through a lot of that, but the adjustment took time. When Emma came home, she was shocked at how much had changed. I'd taken care of all the repairs around the house, repainted most rooms, and completely redone our bedroom. But it wasn't just the house that was different. I was different. I no longer wanted a traditional job. I turned to day trading full-time, which gave us the freedom to take spontaneous vacations, something Emma loved. She was also impressed by how fit I'd become. She even started going to the gym with me, though she wasn't interested in joining me for karate. We settled into a new routine, hitting the gym together 3 times a week, while I kept up with my karate classes twice a week. Our relationship reignited in ways I hadn't expected. After everything we'd been through, we knew not to take a single moment for granted. Our intimacy grew stronger, our connection deeper. We both realized how close we had come to losing it all. Mia is getting married in 3 months, and Emma is deeply involved in planning the wedding. Sophie is pregnant with her first child, a boy, and the girls call us almost daily. Mia even moved in for a few weeks after I got home from the hospital, insisting on helping, though I was relieved when she went back to her own place. I didn't need another wife hovering over me. Emma and I still worry about each other. In those early weeks, every time we slept together, one of us would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching out just to make sure the other was still there. It took a long time to shake that feeling, that fear of abandonment. At the beginning of this whole ordeal, all I wanted was to understand why she left me. Now, with everything laid bare between us, I know the answer. It wasn't because she stopped loving me. She left to protect us, something I couldn't have imagined at the time. And now, after months of chaos, betrayal, and heartache, we've rebuilt something stronger than what we had before. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.